He stopped in front of Kennel 19, not knowing exactly why. It had been 2 years since Rusty had left, and since then he had avoided any place that reminded him of that pain. The shelter, with its smell of disinfectant and anxious barking, was the last place he thought he would be, but there he stood, hands in his pockets and a heavy heart. "If that dog bites me, I swear I will sue this entire shelter," he muttered to himself, more as a shield than an actual threat. A worker, passing by with a bucket and broom, glanced over and replied with a tired smile, "He doesn't bite, he's just different." The sentence hung in the air like a taunt, and he forced himself to look through the gate. Lying in the corner, as if he had forgotten what it was like to wait for someone, was the strangest dog he had ever seen. Old, his fur matted like weeds after a rain, his eyes were different colors, and he had an air of absolute silence. Nothing about him would catch the attention of an ordinary adopter, but then he saw it. Attached to the worn collar was a brass pendant. He crouched down to read the inscription. "If you are reading this, it is because I was once loved." It struck a chord in him that he had not known was still exposed. The phrase, so simple, disarmed him. Without thinking, he stood up and asked to speak to someone about adoption. The name on the paper was Reggie, and, in some way that made no sense, he knew that he would not leave here alone. The employee explained the basics. Reggie was a hard dog to read. He didn't react like the others. He didn't bark, jump, or beg. He just watched, like someone who already understood everything and waited for the humans to catch up. When they opened the kennel gate, the man expected some movement, maybe a wagging tail or a timid run. But Reggie just stood up slowly, walked over to him, stopped 2 steps away, and looked. Those eyes, one brown, the other half grey, didn't ask for anything. They were just there, present, attentive. He held out his hand, and Reggie didn't hesitate. He put his nose to it as if to say, "Okay, let's try." And so it was. A signed contract, an old leash tied to the collar, and the two walked together through the front door, each trying to understand what had just happened. The drive home was silent, but comfortable. Reggie sat in the back seat, as if he already knew the route, without barking, without trying to climb in front, just staring out the window. The man, behind the wheel, watched in the rearview mirror with a strange sense of déjà vu. When he parked, he got out of the car, opened the back door, and waited. Reggie got out slowly, sniffed the air, looked around, and entered the house without needing an invitation. He didn't run. He didn't inspect everything. He stopped in the living room, turned around, and lay down on the rug where Rusty usually lay. The man sat on the couch, not knowing what to say. There were no tricks, no commands, just an old dog who seemed to have chosen this corner of the world to rest again. And that, for now, was enough. In the early days, their coexistence was marked by a strange dance of observation. Reggie ate slowly, slept a lot, and walked around the house as if he had known every room forever. The man did not force himself to get close. He had learned through grief that some presences are made in the other person's time. Reggie seemed to understand this too. He was not the kind of dog who needed constant attention, but he was always close by. If he went to the kitchen, Reggie would follow him and lie down near the door. If he spent a lot of time on the porch, Reggie would settle down next to him, eyes half closed, as if on guard. He was a discreet but firm presence, and little by little, that began to bring an unexpected peace. The first sign that something deeper was going on came one Saturday morning. The man threw an old tennis ball into the yard, more out of habit than invitation. He thought Reggie would ignore it, like he always did with toys, but to his surprise, the dog walked up to the ball, sniffed it for a long time, and then, rather slowly, pushed it back with his nose. It wasn't a game. It was a gesture, as if to say, "I remember that." The man smiled for the first time in a long time, not the polite smile that is given out of obligation, but the one that comes from deep within, that scratches the throat before coming out. He stared at Reggie, who was already calmly walking back to the shade of the tree, and something settled inside him. Maybe it was the beginning of a cure. If this part touched you, like and share it with someone who also needs to start healing. As the weeks passed, their routines fell into place like pieces of an old puzzle that had been rediscovered. Reggie didn't demand anything, but he was there for everything. He woke up with him, waited outside the bathroom, lay down next to the table while the man worked on the computer. It was as if he filled the empty spaces that Rusty had left, but without trying to replace him. The man began to notice that he didn't feel so alone anymore. There was still silence. There was still the emptiness of loss. But now that silence had company. Sometimes he would talk to Reggie as if he were speaking to his own thoughts out loud. He didn't expect a response, and perhaps that was precisely what comforted him the most. It was one Sunday afternoon while cleaning Reggie's collar that the man noticed the back of the medallion. With his thumb, he removed the accumulated dirt and revealed an address engraved almost imperceptibly. That aroused a sense of uneasiness. Who had written that? Why did they leave him there? After a while of hesitation, he decided to visit the place, driven by an impulse that even he could not explain. He got in the car with Reggie in the back seat as usual and drove to the address, a simple house with an unkempt garden and shuttered windows. He knocked on the door with his heart racing, feeling strange to be there. But before he could give up, a gentleman opened the door with tired eyes and a weak voice. "Are you with him?" The man nodded silently and stepped back so that Reggie could be seen. The old man, looking at the dog, didn't say anything right away. He just crouched down slowly, reached out a trembling hand, and touched the top of Reggie's head with a gentleness that seemed to contain years of longing. "He was my son's," he murmured, his voice breaking. "After Alex died, I couldn't take care of him anymore." The man listened, not knowing what to make of this information. The old man continued, "I thought he needed another chance, but I never stopped wondering if he was okay." Reggie leaned against the old man's leg, silent, as if he understood everything. The reunion wasn't a breakup, it was a bridge between pasts. The three of them sat on the porch. The old man told him about Alex, a young nurse who used Reggie as a support dog during home visits. He said the two were inseparable until a car accident took the life of his son one rainy morning. Since then, Reggie had changed. He was quieter, more withdrawn, as if he knew he had lost someone who was his other half, the old man said. When the man mentioned the tennis ball and the way Reggie had reacted to it, the old man's eyes filled with tears. It was their favorite toy. They played with it together in the park every evening. The moment was sad, but not somber. It was an exchange of memories, a piece of life returned to someone who had already lost so much. And in that moment, it was clear that Reggie was not coming back. He was staying. On the way home, the man drove in silence, but his heart was beating. Reggie slept in the back seat, his head propped up on an old t-shirt he used to wear on the days when he missed Rusty the most. The visit hadn't changed the course of history, but it had given more clarity to what had previously been only speculation. Now he knew where Reggie came from, the kind of love he had known before, and why he had such silence in his eyes. And for some reason, it made the connection between them even deeper. When he got home, he opened the door, waited for Reggie to come in, and sat down next to him on the living room rug. For the first time, he said out loud, "You can stay as long as you want." The following days brought something new. It wasn't just the same old peaceful coexistence. There was a different lightness in Reggie, as if the visit to the past had lifted some weight he was carrying. He seemed more present, more available. He would stop to watch the birds through the window, accept petting for longer periods of time, and even shyly wag his tail when the man returned from the market. It was one autumn afternoon, however, that everything changed. The man took Reggie to the park, a new habit they had adopted. There, as they walked slowly among dry trees and empty benches, they saw a child crying alone, sitting next to a fallen bicycle. Before he could react, Reggie approached on his own and lay down next to the boy, resting his nose on his leg. The boy gradually stopped crying, first out of surprise, then out of comfort. He began to stroke Reggie's fur with small, timid fingers until the crying turned to sobbing and the sobbing turned to silence. The man approached and asked if he was okay, and the boy simply nodded, never letting go of the dog's hand. A woman approached shortly after, panting, calling for her grandson. When she saw the scene, she stopped for a moment, moved. He has trouble talking to people, but with the dog. Look at that, she said. The man didn't know what to say, but something inside him knew. Reggie had this gift, a gift that didn't come from training or tricks. It was just presence. After that day, the invitations started to come in. The local school heard about the dog who helped children stay calm and asked to be brought there. On the first day, Reggie walked into the support room and walked straight to a boy in the back of the room, sitting with his hands over his ears. Without barking, without asking for attention, he lay down at her feet. The teacher stood still, not understanding. Minutes later, the boy, who rarely made eye contact, took his hands off his ears and began to stroke Reggie's fur. He didn't speak, but he smiled. It was enough. From that day on, Reggie visited the school once a week, not as a trained therapy dog, but as himself. And as always, all you had to do was be there. Over time, Reggie's story spread. A social worker who had heard about the school visits suggested that he be introduced to a community center that sheltered veterans. The man was hesitant at first. He thought this was all too much for him when he adopted Reggie, but the dog always seemed to have something new to offer. On his first visit to the center, Reggie walked slowly among the men who sat silently, many with blank stares, others with shaking hands. He stopped in front of one of them, a former soldier with a hard expression, and rested his head on his knee. The man stood still at first. Then, with firm but gentle hands, he began to stroke the top of the dog's head, his eyes filling with tears. No one said anything, and yet everyone understood. The man began to carry a notebook with him when he visited, a simple black-covered notebook where he recorded the important moments they experienced together. He began by writing down people's reactions, the small changes he saw in their faces and gestures. Then he began to write about himself as well, about how he woke up feeling lighter, about how there were nights when he felt peace just listening to the rhythm of Reggie's breathing by his side. The notebook became a diary, a silent testimony of everything that dog was doing, for him and for others. Reggie, without knowing it, was rebuilding not only the life of the man who had adopted him, but of an entire network of people who learned to breathe better, just by sharing space with him. It was during a visit to a children's library that Reggie revealed yet another of his talents. One of the librarians, upon hearing about the dog's visits to the school, suggested that he take part in a reading project with shy children or those in the process of learning to read. The idea was simple. The children would read aloud to Reggie. As always, he would simply lie down next to them, listening in silence, without correcting, without laughing, without interrupting. The result was surprising. Children who had barely spoken in groups began to read, hesitantly at first, but then more firmly. It was as if Reggie was saying, with his body and his eyes, that no one would be judged there, and that, for a child, could be everything. Weeks turned into months, and the man found himself involved in a new routine he had never imagined. In the mornings, I took care of the house, read, and wrote in my diary. In the afternoons, I accompanied Reggie on visits to schools, centers, libraries, and even some nursing homes. In all of them, the effect was the same. Where there was pain, silence, or fear, Reggie planted a seed of calm. He never learned tricks, never gave a paw, never sought applause, but his presence was enough for something to change. The man began to realize that mourning itself had changed. He still missed Rusty, of course, but it wasn't an absence that hurt anymore. It was a memory that made room for everything Reggie had been bringing. One rainy afternoon in November, during a visit to a grief support group, something remarkable happened. a middle-aged woman who had lost her husband and had been attending the group for months without ever speaking a word, simply knelt down in front of Reggie and began to pet him. She wept silently for several minutes. Then, still with her hand in his fur, she spoke softly. He liked dogs. We had one just like him. It was the first time her voice had echoed in the room. The other members of the group fell silent, respecting this rare moment. And the man, watching from afar, understood that Reggie was not just listening, he was liberating. Over time, Reggie's age began to take its toll. He no longer climbed onto the couch easily, he slept longer hours throughout the day, and his steps were slower. The man noticed these changes with a mixture of concern and acceptance. He knew that his time with him would not be infinite, but there was no room for regrets. Reggie had lived long enough to make more of a difference than many humans would make in a lifetime. The visits continued, but less frequently. Still, when they arrived, faces would light up. "He's back," the children would say. "Our silent friend," the elderly would say. It was as if he left a part of himself in every place he went, even before he left. One night, as the man was organizing some journal entries, Reggie came over and laid his head on his foot. It was a simple gesture, but it was full of meaning. He stopped writing and just lay there, silent, feeling the warmth of that old, faithful body. He ran his hand gently over the gray fur, noticing how the muzzle was whiter and the eyes more tired. "It's okay, Reggie," he whispered. "You've done more than I could ever dream of." And in that moment, he knew he was no longer afraid of losing, because what Reggie would leave behind would not be a void, it would be a trail. The next morning, Reggie didn't get up. He was wrapped up in his favorite blanket, the one the man always left in the corner of the couch. He seemed calm, as if he knew his time had come. The man knelt down beside him and stayed there for hours, without needing to say anything. He cried, yes, but without the despair he had before. It was a calm cry, of gratitude, of respectful farewell. He knew that Reggie had fulfilled his mission, and more than that, he knew that somehow the dog had prepared him for that moment, because Reggie hadn't come to fill Rusty's place. He had come to make room inside him for everything that would come later. Have you ever experienced something like this? Comment below. Sometimes sharing helps more than it seems. In the days that followed, the house seemed quieter than ever, but it wasn't a lonely silence. It was as if every corner still held Reggie's presence, the rug where he slept, the bowl of water that the man still hadn't had the courage to put away, and the notebook on the table, now more valuable than ever. The man spent hours rereading the accounts, reliving each encounter, each transformation they witnessed together. Each page carried not just memories, but a purpose. And that was what made him make a decision. Reggie couldn't just be remembered. He needed to keep breathing in. He began by going to the same places they had often visited together. He explained Reggie's absence carefully, and to his surprise, everyone understood. Children showed him drawings. Elderly people told him how he had helped them sleep better. And even the ex-soldier at the community center asked, "You're going to keep coming, right?" And he decided he would. He took his notebook with him, read excerpts from the stories, and invited people to write their own stories with Reggie. The notebook became a living memorial, a space where the dog's silence was transformed into the words of those who had been touched by him. And so, without realizing it, the man became the guardian of something greater than he had expected, the legacy of a dog who knew how to listen. Little by little, word about the diary of the healing dog spread throughout the city. A small local newspaper ran an article telling Reggie's story and how he had impacted so many lives. The article touched many people, and more invitations came in. Libraries, schools in other neighborhoods, shelters, all wanting to hear about the silent dog who brought peace. The man, who had previously avoided any exposure, accepted the invitations naturally. It wasn't about him, after all. It was about Reggie, and telling his story was the best way to keep him alive. Every time he opened the notebook and read a passage, it was as if the dog was there, watching everything with those eyes that said more than any words. If you're feeling something while reading this, maybe it's time to follow the page. We'll continue this listening together. It was during one of these visits that a psychologist approached after a presentation and suggested something new, turning the diary into a book. He said many people could benefit from the story, even those who never met Reggie. The man was silent for a few seconds, surprised. The idea had never crossed his mind. For him, the diary was intimate, almost sacred. But when he looked at the line of children waiting to touch the pages where the stories were, he realized that it wasn't just his anymore. Reggie belonged to everyone. And then, with a shy smile, he replied, "I think he would like that." In the following months, the man dedicated himself to transforming the diary into a book. He didn't change the original words. He kept each account the way he wrote it on the day they lived it. He simply organized the stories, added dates, places, and little comments about what he learned from each experience. He reread it several times, sometimes moved, sometimes smiling to himself. And in every reading, I felt Reggie present. The process, more than an editorial project, was a way to continue living with the dog. It was as if each line written reinforced his presence in the days that followed. And when the book was finally finished, titled "The Dog Who Listened," he felt that something important had come to an end, and something else, bigger, was just beginning. The launch was low-key at a community center where Reggie was well known. There was no stage or microphone. The man simply sat down with a group of people and began to read passages aloud. Each story brought back a moment, a transformation, a gesture from Reggie. People were moved, and some began to share their own pain, their losses, their overcoming. That night was not about a book. It was about connection. And it was when a small girl, with tiny hands and attentive eyes, approached and asked, "Will he come back?" that the man knelt down, looked into her eyes and said, "He is already here, right among us." And everyone, in that moment, knew it was true. After that night, the man decided to do something he had never imagined. He created a small foundation in Reggie's name. The idea was simple but powerful: to promote listening, empathy, and emotional care in schools, communities, and care institutions. It didn't need big resources. All we needed was to bring together people willing to listen, welcome, and be present. He used the stories in the book as a basis for meetings, workshops, and discussion groups. He would take a blanket just like Reggie's, place it in the center of the room, and say, "This is where Reggie would lie down to listen." That was enough to open hearts. At each meeting, Reggie's silence continued to teach more than any speech. One day, during a visit to an orphanage, a boy sat down next to the blanket and stared at it as if he was waiting for something to happen. The man approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt. The boy, without looking away, spoke softly. "He really listened, didn't he?" The man nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "And if we listen like he did, will it help others too?" The boy asked. That hit him hard. That was exactly what Reggie did. Without speaking, without judging, just being present. The man answered, "Yes, it does. Sometimes it helps more than any words." And there, in that simple room, with shy voices and curious looks, the certainty was born that Reggie was still on a mission, only now, through each person who learned to listen like he did. Over time, other people began to take the idea further. Teachers created Reggie corners in classrooms, with pillows, books, and space for students to calm down and talk. Nurses created small areas of silence in hospital corridors, inspired by the calm presence the dog brought wherever he went. And in several communities, murals appeared with drawings, phrases, and stories about him. It was not an organized movement. It was spontaneous. Like Reggie, nobody charged, nobody commanded. Things just happened, as if his memory circulated in the form of attitude. And that, to the man, was the most beautiful part of it all. Even with all this activity, he still made time for the small rituals of daily life. He would take walks around the square where Reggie liked to go, stop by the library, sit on the same park bench where they had first seen him comfort the child. It wasn't nostalgia, it was connection. It was remembering, yes, but also carrying on. And every now and then, someone would sit next to him to tell him how Reggie had helped them get through a difficult day, a moment of grief, or an insecurity. At those times, he listened more than he spoke. And when people asked him how he managed to keep it all up, he would answer simply, "I just follow what he did. I'm here, present." It was during one of these walks through the square that the man found a woman sitting on the ground with a dog in her arms. The animal was shaking, visibly frightened, and the woman seemed lost, not knowing what to do. The man approached her calmly, knelt down beside her, and asked if she needed help. She told him that she had found the dog abandoned and didn't know if she should take him home. She said that she had no experience, that she was afraid of getting attached and then suffering. The man listened to everything in silence and then told her about Reggie. He didn't give her advice. He didn't try to convince her. He simply shared his story. And at the end, he said, "Sometimes it's the love we give that heals the pain we feel." The woman cried softly and took the dog home that same night. Time passed. Reggie's book was reprinted. The foundation grew slowly but with deep roots. The man went on with his life, now lighter, more connected. He still missed the past, but it was no longer a burden. It was a reminder of everything that was worth it. He learned that healing comes in its own time, and that silence, when filled with presence, can be more transformative than 1,000 words. And whenever someone asked why that story touched so many people, he would say, "Because deep down, everyone just wants to be truly heard, and Reggie did that like no one else." And so, even after he left, the old dog with watchful eyes continued to listen to the world, through all those who learned from him. On a warm spring afternoon, the man received a letter from a rural school. It was handwritten in simple handwriting by a teacher named Elisa. She told how she had used Reggie's book to work on empathy with her students, and how a very withdrawn girl had begun to open up after reading a passage aloud. The teacher thanked her and said that even though she had never met the dog in person, she felt as if he had passed through her classroom. The man read the letter more than once with tears in his eyes. Each word confirmed what he already felt. Reggie had become part of something much bigger than himself. Inspired by the letter, the man began visiting small towns with the book and notebook, sometimes to talk, sometimes just to listen. He created simple gatherings called Reggie, listening circles, where people would sit in a circle, read a story and share their own. It wasn't therapy, nor a lecture. It was just space, safe, welcoming space. And it was impressive how, at the end of each meeting, people left feeling lighter. Many said they had never been heard like that. And even though Reggie wasn't physically there, his energy filled everything. It was as if he still guided the man, not with barks or tugs on the leash, but with that same silence that always knew exactly what to do. During one of these sessions, at a rural public school, a teenage girl raised her hand and asked to read a passage from the book aloud. Her voice was shaking, but gradually it became more firm. When she finished, she said, "I lost someone too, and I always thought no one noticed how much it affected me." The room was completely silent. Then she concluded, "But now I think I can start talking about it." The man just smiled and thanked her. He knew this was the kind of moment Reggie would have understood perfectly, without having to say anything, just by being there. Even with all the rush of meetings and trips, he maintained a personal habit, writing, not only in the original notebook, but in new notebooks that he filled with reflections, memories, and small discoveries about life. Sometimes he wrote letters to Reggie, as if he were still by his side. "Today we helped a lady who hadn't left her house in months," one said. "You would have lain on her lap, I'm sure." These letters were not meant to be read by others. They were an ongoing, intimate conversation, as if Reggie were a permanent presence, even after he was gone. And in a way, that was exactly what he had become, an invisible link between pain and healing, between silence and presence. One rainy afternoon, as he was returning from a performance at a cultural centre, the man stopped in front of the old veterinary clinic where Reggie had had his first checkups. The place was closed. The windows were dusty, but the sign still read, "Caring is listening." He smiled as he remembered his first appointment when the vet had said, "This one has an old soul." At the time, he didn't quite understand what that meant. Now it made perfect sense. Reggie wasn't just an old dog. He was someone who seemed to have lived other lives and who had come to teach, without rushing, what it means to be truly present in the pain of others. One day, during a visit to a technical school, a young student asked, something the man had never heard before, "If you could thank Reggie for just one thing, what would it be?" The question took him by surprise. He was silent for a few seconds, feeling the answer grow from within. And then he said, "For making me trust again." It was true. Before Reggie, he thought his heart had closed forever, that the loss of Rusty was a sign that it was no longer worth getting attached to again. But Reggie, with all his calm and silence, proved otherwise. He showed that loving again is not about disrespecting the person who is gone, but about honoring what you have lived and allowing love to continue to exist. With each city he visited, the man realized that Reggie's story touched different people for different reasons. For some, he was a symbol of overcoming, for others, of welcome. But there was one thing that nearly every story had in common. Reggie represented something missing in people's lives. Someone who would just listen. No rush, no judgment, no trying to fix it. Just being there was enough. And that said a lot about the world they lived in, where so many people carried their pain in silence. Reggie, without ever saying a word, made those pains no longer invisible. It was then that the idea of setting up a traveling exhibition came about. Reggie, the silence that heals. He gathered photos, children's drawings, excerpts from the diary and symbolic objects, such as the blanket, the tennis ball, and a reproduction of the brass plaque. The exhibition passed through cultural centers, libraries, and even subway stations. It was simple, but touching. In each location, he set up a listening space where people could write letters to someone who had passed away or simply leave a note telling something they never had the courage to say out loud. And at the end, they left the note in a box labeled "For Reggie." It was a way to ease the soul, and the line, to his surprise, was never short. During one of these exhibitions, a slow-moving, white-haired woman approached him with an envelope in her hands. She said she didn't want to leave her note in the box, but rather to give it directly to him. It was a letter written to her son, who had died 10 years ago, something she had never been able to do until then. "It was Reggie who gave me the courage," she said, her eyes moist. The man held the envelope carefully, as if he were receiving a piece of this woman's history. And there, once again, he understood that Reggie was not just a memory. He was a catalyst, a link between what was and what could still be healed. The routine began to be divided between meetings, exhibitions, visits, and moments of seclusion. Despite his busy schedule, the man maintained the habit of walking alone on Sunday mornings, repeating the route he used to take with Reggie. He would pass by the cafe on the corner, where the dog would get snacks, by the bench in the square, where they would rest in the shade, and end up at home, where he would put on some soft music and write. These moments were not nostalgic, but comforting. They were like lighting internal candles, keeping alive the presence that had so transformed his life. Because even with so many activities, it was there, in the silence of home, with the memory of Reggie, that he felt whole. It was during one of those Sundays that he decided to do something symbolic. He took Reggie's collar, still stored in a wooden box in the closet, and hung it on the living room wall just above the original notebook, not as a sad reminder, but as a milestone, a reminder of everything that had been born from that simple act of adoption years ago. Whenever someone new came to his house, whether they were journalists, volunteers, or students, He would tell the story of the collar, the tag, and the meaningful silence that accompanied Reggie. It became a ritual, a way of presenting not only who Reggie was, but everything he represented. One ordinary afternoon, when he returned from a listening circle, he found a brown envelope on his doorstep with no sender. Inside was a pencil drawing of Reggie, lying under a tree, surrounded by smiling children. In the bottom corner, a sentence written in childish handwriting: "He listened to me when no one else did." The man held the paper for long minutes, unable to look away. I didn't know who had left it or what city it came from, but that hardly mattered. This was further proof that Reggie's presence continued to circulate throughout the world, invisible but pulsating, like a good echo that refuses to fade away. After this drawing, the man created a mural at home, an entire wall dedicated to the messages, letters, photos, and drawings I received over the years. I didn't organize it by date or theme. I just pasted everything together as it arrived, forming a chaotic and lively mosaic. Whenever someone new came in, he would say, "This is Reggie's mural. Every piece here is someone he listened to." And people spent long minutes there reading, smiling, sometimes crying. It was more than a wall. It was a physical testament to the impact of a dog who never had to bark to be heard. Over time, schools began to replicate the mural. Photos of Reggie's murals appeared on social media in various places: hospital hallways, waiting rooms, libraries, and even prisons. In every corner, a message, a story, a memory. The man never expected all of this to take on this proportion, but he was not scared. On the contrary, he felt honored to witness it, and most importantly, he remained firm in his purpose: to continue listening, because he knew that Reggie's silence had not come to fill any space. He had come to teach, and now it was his responsibility to ensure that this lesson would never be forgotten. During a talk at a conference on emotional education, the man was invited to close the event with Reggie's story. He went up on stage with the original notebook in his hands, looked at the packed audience, and simply said, "This notebook started out as a diary to remind me of the good days. Today it is proof that a dog can change the world without saying a single word." He read a simple passage about the first time Reggie pushed the ball with his nose. The audience listened in complete silence, and at the end they gave a standing ovation, not for the man's merits, but for the living memory of a being who had touched so many lives with his calmness and listening. After the lecture, a young man approached him in the hallway, visibly moved. He said he had suffered from severe anxiety since he was a teenager, and that during one of the exhibits, he found a letter on the wall that described exactly what he was feeling and how Reggie had helped someone else through the same darkness. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "This story made me feel less alone." The man hugged him with the same calmness with which Reggie approached those who needed him most. And in that gesture, he felt that the old dog's mission continued to be fulfilled, one person at a time, because what started as an unpretentious adoption was, some time ago, much more than that. It was one of those early mornings when sleep simply won't come, that the man decided to reread the entire diary from beginning to end. He turned on a dim light in the living room, made some tea, and settled down on the sofa with the notebook on his lap. Each page brought back a memory, a face, a gesture. The silence in the house was the same as always, but that night it seemed even more charged with presence. When he reached the last passage, written on the day Reggie left, he closed his eyes for a few minutes. There was no sadness. There was gratitude. He knew that few are lucky enough to live a story like this. The next day, he wrote one last letter to Reggie, short, direct, as if they were sunbathing together in the backyard. "You taught me to trust, to feel, to listen, and that's why today I'm fine. Not because you left, but because you passed and stayed." He folded the letter carefully, put it inside the notebook, and closed it. He didn't feel the need for anything else. It was the end of one cycle and the beginning of another, because now, even without Reggie around, he had become someone who knew how to listen. Really, and that was the greatest gift the old dog could have left. In the following months, the man began training new volunteers for the Foundation's projects. He did not teach techniques, nor did he give rigid instructions. He just told stories. He explained how Reggie acted, what he transmitted with his gaze, what changed the energy of a room just with his presence. Many of the volunteers did not have pets, some had never lived with dogs, but everyone left the meetings feeling like they could be a part of it, that listening was an accessible, human, powerful act. It was the kind of learning that didn't require a loud voice, just a willingness to be fully present in the other person's moment. At one of these trainings, a young volunteer asked him if he still missed Reggie. The man smiled before answering, "Yes, I do, but not like before. Today, it's a longing that follows me like a shadow, not a burden." She was silent for a moment, taking in his answer, and he continued, "What Reggie taught me didn't end when he left. On the contrary, it started there, because now I'm the one listening. And who knows, maybe one day you'll teach this to someone else too." The young woman nodded, moved. That was how the story went. It didn't end, it just changed shape, spreading among those willing to listen. Over time, the man was invited to more places, not because he was a famous writer or a charismatic speaker, but because he carried something that people recognized from afar: truth. In every speech, every listening circle, every visit, he brought with him the living memory of Reggie. Sometimes he told the dog's story from the beginning. Sometimes he simply read a letter left by someone, but always there was silence afterwards. A silence full of meaning, where people took a deep breath, dried their eyes, and smiled. It was as if for an instant they all connected to something they had forgotten existed, the ability to feel with the other. It was on one of these visits that he received an unexpected proposal. A group of educators wanted to create, with your help, a permanent emotional education program in public schools, inspired by Reggie's story. The idea was simple: to train students to listen, welcome, and respect each other's silences and pain. The man, moved, accepted without hesitation. Not out of vanity, but because I knew Reggie would have loved the idea. Seeing children learning from an early age that presence is worth more than advice, that listening is as important as talking, and in that moment, he felt that something truly lasting was being born, something that Reggie would surely approve of with a calm look and a wagging tail. The project in schools started out timidly, with few classes and simple activities, but it only took a semester for teachers to notice the difference. Students were calmer, more attentive to their classmates, and there were fewer conflicts in the classroom. Parents began to comment at meetings on how different their children were at home. More empathetic, more patient. The man followed everything closely, visiting each school in turn, talking to the teachers, and reading the notes that the students themselves wrote. One of them said, "I learned that listening to someone with your heart is like giving a hug without using your arms." He kept this note in his pocket for days as a constant reminder that they were on the right track. One day, as he was finishing one of these visits, he was approached by a child with a very serious expression. "Do you think Reggie knows all this?" he asked. The man crouched down, looked the child straight in the eye, and replied, "I think he does, and that's even better than knowing." The child nodded, satisfied, and ran off to play. He stood there for a moment, watching the playground filled with voices, laughter, and little eavesdropping happening in every corner. He realized that it no longer mattered how many people knew his name. What mattered was how many knew Reggie's story, because in the end, that was what kept changing the world, one act of listening at a time. At the turn of the year, the man decided to do something symbolic. He took all the notebooks he had filled out over the years, the original and the others, and organized them on a new, custom-made bookshelf in the Foundation's office. Each one represented a phase of the journey with Reggie: the discovery, the encounters, the losses, the learning. Above the bookshelf, he hung a picture of the old dog, taken someday in the park, his muzzle slightly dirty with dirt and his eyes half closed in the sun. It was his favorite image because it didn't feel like a pose, but a genuine capture of who Reggie was, peace in the form of presence. During the inauguration ceremony of the Foundation's new headquarters, the man was called to say a few words. He went up to the small stage with one of the notebooks in his hand, but he didn't read anything. He just looked at the audience, volunteers, teachers, parents, children, and said, "All of this came about because one day I decided to trust again." There was a beautiful silence, the kind that no one wants to break. "I wasn't the one who changed these lives. He was. I just listened and I kept going." And with that, he got off the stage and sat in the middle of the audience, as he always did. Because Reggie taught him that being by someone's side is worth more than being in front. And that was how he chose to live. Over time, the Foundation's impact began to cross borders. Messages began arriving from other countries, people who had read the translated book or participated in online listening circles. Some have reported profound changes after applying the listening method in their own communities. Others were simply grateful to have heard the story. The man read each one carefully, responded whenever he could, and kept them all on file, not out of vanity, but out of reverence. Each message was a new link in that silent chain that Reggie had started, with no idea how far it could go. In an interview for a documentary about animals and human emotions, the man was asked if he believed. Reggie knew how special he was. He smiled, thought for a few seconds, and replied, Reggie didn't need to know, he just needed to be. And that's what made him so special. The interviewer fell silent, visibly touched. And the man added, maybe that's the secret. We don't need to understand everything. Sometimes we just need to be there, whole. It was this simplicity that he valued most. And it was exactly this that made Reggie's story continue to touch so many people, even after so much time. One sunny morning, the man received an invitation to attend a memorial service at the park where he and Reggie used to walk. The city, along with the community, had decided to plant a tree in memory of the dog. It wouldn't be a statue or a plaque full of text, just a tree with a small wooden plaque that read, "For those who knew how to listen." The man was moved. The idea was perfect, understated, vibrant, and with room to grow. At the ceremony, as the tree was being planted, several people left notes in a small basket at the foot of the seedling. Each one contained a memory, a thank you, or a simple, "Thank you, Reggie." In the days that followed, the man began to visit the tree frequently. I sat on the bench next to it, watched the movement in the park, and remained there in silence. Sometimes, someone would sit down next to him and start talking. Other times, they left notes at the base of the tree. That place, over time, became a new meeting point. It was not a place of mourning, but of welcome, as if Reggie's presence had taken root there too, spreading through the leaves, the wind, the eyes of the people who stopped to breathe. And the man knew deep down that this was the home of everything they had built together. Years passed, and the man now had gray hair and slower steps, yet he was still steadfast in his purpose. The listening circles, the meetings with schools, the visits to communities, everything continued, albeit at a different pace. Now, it was the volunteers who carried out most of the activities, many of them directly inspired by their journey with Reggie. Some never met him in person, but spoke of him as if he were an old friend. That was how he continued to exist, in his speeches, in his listening, in the simple gestures that welcomed the other without asking for anything in return. At one of these meetings, at the end of a listening circle, a child approached and asked, "Do you still miss him?" The man looked up at the sky before answering, "Yes, I do, but the longing has turned into a garden." The child frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" And he explained, "Before, longing was pain. Now, it blooms." The girl smiled and said, "Then his tree must be full of flowers." And it was. That tree that they had planted years ago was growing strong, with wide branches and generous shade. The man didn't need to say anything else. He knew that, as long as that tree existed and everything it represented, Reggie would never stop listening to the world. In his later years, the man began writing another book. It wasn't about Reggie, at least not directly. It was about what he learned from him, about silence, about presence, about the value of genuine listening. He called the book The Things I Learned from a Dog Who Never Spoke. It was a more reflective work, but still simple, direct, like all the stories he shared. I didn't expect it to be a success, nor would I do it. He wrote as a way of continuing the dialogue that began that day in front of Kennel 19. Each chapter was like a new letter, a conversation that spanned time. When the book was released, he received messages from readers who had never read the first one, but who found themselves transformed by its pages. People who had started listening more to their children, their partners, their parents. People who had learned to pause before responding, to offer presence instead of solutions. The man read each of these messages with the same humility he always had. He knew that none of it was his own doing. It was the reflection of a simple choice he made years ago when he decided to open his heart again. And every time someone said, "This book made me listen better," he would smile softly and murmur, "You would have liked that, Reggie." One quiet afternoon, the man decided to visit the tree once more. He took with him one of his first notebooks, now yellowed with age, and sat on his usual bench. There were few people in the park. The wind was light, and the sound of the leaves created a soft melody. He stayed there for hours, rereading his words, remembering each stage of that journey. At a certain point, he closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and placed his hand over his heart. He felt that he had fulfilled his part, that the cycle was complete, not by absence, but by plenitude. It was as if Reggie, somewhere in time, nodded silently. Send this video to someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's just what their day was asking. That same week, he wrote his last entry in his journal. Today, another child sat down next to me and said he wanted to listen to the world like Reggie. I smiled and said that was the best way to start. He calmly closed the notebook, placed it on the shelf next to the others, and watched everything for a few minutes. The house was silent, but alive, full of stories, presence, and good echoes. And that was when he understood for good. Reggie hadn't just come to heal him. He had come to prepare him to heal others. And now that that was clear, he could rest, because the dog who never spoke had taught the whole world how to listen. In the last chapter of the book, he wrote a simple dedication: to all who have ever been listened to without being interrupted, and to those who have yet to discover the power of a silence full of love. The launch was low-key, like everything he did. No big events, just a listening circle in the park, under the shade of Reggie's tree. People came from far and wide, sat around him, and shared their own stories. And there, amidst memories and quiet laughter, he realized that Reggie had become part of the collective memory of everyone who had learned to care for others without having to say much. As the meeting came to a close, the man stood last. He placed his hand on the bark of the tree, closed his eyes, and gave thanks for everything, for the pain that had brought him here, for the chance that had placed him in front of Kennel 19, for the words engraved on the brass plaque, and for every life that had been changed since then. Then he walked slowly to the bench and sat down one last time. He watched the people leave, one by one, and smiled. He knew his mission was complete. Reggie, the dog who never spoke, didn't just find a home that day. He made one, and he left the doors open so everyone could come in and finally be heard. Have you stuck around? Show it was worth it. Like, comment, or share. Reggie's story will only continue if you help spread it.